Belgium, December the 17th, 1944, 5:42 p.m. The snow fell slowly, quietly, almost peacefully. A white blanket over the Ardennes. Nature looked calm, frozen in silence, as if it refused to acknowledge the war tearing Europe apart. But inside that stillness, 11 American soldiers pushed through the forest. Their boots crushed frozen mud, their breath formed clouds in the bitter air, and their uniforms were soaked with snow and sweat. They moved without formation, without guidance, just instinct and survival. They were part of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit. Hours earlier, they had held their position under the shock of the German offensive, the opening blow of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. When German tanks and infantry poured through the lines, many American units retreated, but the men of the 333rd stayed and fired, lowering their howitzers to point-blank range, turning artillery pieces into giant shotguns. They held their ground long enough for other battalions to escape. Their courage saved hundreds of lives. It also isolated them behind enemy lines. Now they were fugitives in the snow, not prisoners, not combatants, but hunted men. Among them was Staff Sergeant Thomas Fort, steady and strong. Sergeant William Pritchett, quiet but sharp-eyed. PFC George Motton leaned on his rifle, his gloves torn, fingers numb. Corporal Major Bradley whispered a prayer under his breath every few minutes, partly for God, partly to keep himself conscious. They were exhausted, carrying wounds, frostbite, fear. And something heavier, the knowledge that capture meant something worse than a bullet. They were fighting the Nazi regime, but they were also fighting its ideology. To the SS, black soldiers were not soldiers. They were targets. They were symbols to erase. They walked in silence. Talking wasted breath. Hope was fragile, too fragile to share with words. After hours in the forest, they reached a tiny Belgian village, Wereth, a collection of small homes, smoke rising from a few chimneys, lights flickering inside, civilization, warmth, humanity. Thomas Fort approached a farmhouse hesitantly and knocked. The door opened just enough for a face to appear, Matthias Langer, a farmer. Behind him, his wife Maria looked worried, but kind. For a moment, the soldiers only stood there, exhausted, shaking, staring into a doorway that could mean life or death. Langer studied their faces. The situation was dangerous for him, for his family, for everyone in that small house. Helping American soldiers behind German lines was a death sentence. He opened the door wider. "Come," he said softly. Inside, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Maria hurried to bring coffee and bread. The men sat near the stove, snow melting off their coats. Some closed their eyes. Some just stared at their hands, grateful to feel heat again. In that farmhouse, for the first time since the battle, they weren't soldiers, they were human beings. But safety in war is fragile. Hope is fragile. A neighbor saw them enter the home, a man with sympathy for the SS. He slipped away into the night to alert a nearby patrol. While the soldiers rested, danger moved closer through the snow. Outside, engines growled, boots crunched, voices barked orders in German. The night that brought comfort was about to deliver betrayal. Soon, an SS patrol from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler arrived. Men trained not only to fight, but to hate. The 11 soldiers heard the noise before the knock. Some reached instinctively for rifles, then stopped. Armed SS units, German territory, civilian family at risk. They knew the rules of war were gone. They knew surrender might not protect them, but fighting here would doom the family who fed them. The door opened. SS troops stood there, armed and expressionless. Thomas Fort looked at his men. No speech, no orders, just a nod, a silent acceptance. They stepped outside into the snow, hands raised, no resistance, no fight, just a quiet dignity. The SS marched them away, not toward town, not toward a prison camp, but toward an open field. Snow fell harder, the world turning white and quiet again. A blanket over truth, a blanket over hatred. The men of the 333rd likely knew what was coming. The Nazis did not hide their views about black soldiers. They did not treat them as prisoners. They treated them as a threat, not to Germany's battlefield, but to its ideology. And the 11 American soldiers walked into the dark knowing this. They had survived artillery, tanks, and war itself, but they were now facing something colder than winter and more deadly than bullets. They would soon face evil not as soldiers, but as black men in the face of Nazi racial doctrine. The snow kept falling, quiet, calm, indifferent, and history was about to bury them, first under winter, then under silence. But before we return to that field, we must understand why these men were never meant to survive in Nazi eyes. Why, decades before this snowy night, Germany had already declared war on their existence. Because to know what happened in Wereth, we must first understand the ideology that made skin color a death sentence. If you believe stories erased by silence must be remembered, then like this video and subscribe. We tell history not to reopen wounds, but to prevent them from ever forming again. In a war fought for freedom, what does it mean when some soldiers had to fight for the right to be remembered? Long before the 11 men of Wereth walked into the snow, before tanks rolled through Belgium, before Europe collapsed into fire, another war had already begun. A war of ideas, printed in newspapers, whispered in schools, shouted in rallies. A war against human dignity. To understand why the SS saw black soldiers not as prisoners but as prey, we must go back, decades before 1944, to the end of World War I. Germany had lost, the Kaiser fled, inflation soared, pride evaporated, chaos filled the streets, and into that chaos came foreign troops to occupy parts of the country, including thousands of colonial soldiers from Africa serving under the French flag. To many Germans, the humiliation of defeat was unbearable. The sight of black men with rifles on German soil became fuel for rage, conspiracy, propaganda. Right-wing groups seized on it immediately. Newspapers and posters depicted African soldiers as beasts, criminals, invaders of German purity. They called it the Black Horror on the Rhine, a racist campaign designed to turn humiliation into hatred. No crime was too absurd to invent. False accusations of mass assaults, of defiling Aryan women, of being symbols sent to destroy German blood. It was fiction. But effective fiction. Hatred rarely needs facts. It only needs fear. Among the voices pushing this idea was a rising political agitator in Munich, Adolf Hitler. In Mein Kampf, he used this propaganda to stoke national trauma, writing that African soldiers contaminated German blood, accusing the French of a plan to destroy the white race. It wasn't just politics, it was obsession. And obsessions grow armies. The racial doctrine takes shape. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, that racism became law. Jews were targeted first and most brutally, but the machine of hate did not stop there. Black Germans became victims of a system designed to erase them. They were fired from jobs, barred from education, arrested on invented charges. Many were forcibly sterilized under the so-called Rhineland Bastards program, a cold, bureaucratic attempt to eliminate future generations. Some disappeared into concentration camps. Their stories rarely appear in textbooks, but the oppression was real, systematic, intentional. In Nazi ideology, the Untermensch, the subhuman, was a category created to justify cruelty. Slavs, Roma, Jews, disabled people, and black people all were targets in a system that turned prejudice into policy and policy into violence. By the late 1930s, the Waffen-SS was not just a military force. It was an ideological army, trained to kill not only enemies, but categories of human beings. To them, a black soldier in uniform was not a soldier. He was a provocation, an insult to racial order, a life not protected by the laws of war. 1940. the first blood. The first major encounter between Nazi forces and large groups of black soldiers came during the fall of France in 1940. Tens of thousands of African troops from French colonies, especially Senegalese tirailleurs, stood in the path of the German invasion. They fought fiercely. Some German commanders were stunned by their discipline and courage, but courage did not protect them. Captured white French soldiers were marched to POW camps. Captured black soldiers were separated, beaten, and executed. It happened across northern France. Fields, quarries, roadside ditches turned into silent graves. One massacre stands as a symbol: Chasselet, near Lyon. French colonial soldiers surrendered. German troops rolled tanks forward, not to intimidate but to crush. Bodies flattened into the earth. Later, French villagers gathered the remains and built a tata, a sacred West African burial ground, to honor them. There was no military reason, no strategic purpose, just ideology made physical. Hate turned into action. German diaries from the time show chilling lines: "Negroes are not soldiers. No need for transport, they will not go to camps." It wasn't written in secret. It wasn't whispered. It was routine, a policy spoken without orders, a permission granted in silence. The American connection. Across the ocean, the United States watched and prepared. When America entered the war in 1941, more than 1 million African Americans would serve. The irony was sharp. They trained in a segregated army, under Jim Crow laws, in a country still struggling with its own deep racism. But when called, they fought, and they fought well. Tank battalions like the 761st Black Panthers, airmen like the legendary Tuskegee pilots, artillery units like the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. Many white officers mocked them at first, until they saw their accuracy, discipline, and resolve in battle. By 1944, these men had earned respect on the front line. But respect in Europe did not erase the danger of capture. They knew what the Wehrmacht believed. They had heard rumors of what happened to colonial troops in France. They knew that falling into SS hands was a death sentence. When the 333rd deployed to the Ardennes, the mission was standard artillery support. No one expected the front to explode. No one expected tanks to burst through the forest. No one expected to fight in snow and chaos. But they did. And when everything fell apart, they didn't abandon their guns. They fired them until they were overrun. Courage in war is often loud. Explosions, orders, shouting. But sometimes courage is quiet. It is simply refusing to leave your post while others run, because someone has to hold the line. The men of the 333rd did that, and afterward they walked into winter carrying not only rifles and wounds, but the weight of history on their shoulders. Their fate was not decided on the battlefield that day. It had been written decades earlier, in propaganda pamphlets, in rallies, in whispered fears about purity, in policies drafted with calm cruelty. What happened in Wereth wasn't sudden. It was the final expression of a hatred manufactured over years. Frozen forests don't kill men, ideas do. What happens to a truth when a nation builds systems to erase it and almost succeeds? Before Wereth, before frozen footsteps and falling snow, there is another story we must face. Not in Europe, but in America. A story that makes the tragedy even harder, even heavier, because the men who bled in foreign woods had already survived another battlefield long before they saw the Ardennes. They grew up in a segregated nation. They trained in segregated bases. They marched under a flag that promised freedom but did not yet fully give it to them. More than 1 million African Americans served in World War II. Most were not allowed to fight. They were assigned to kitchens, supply lines, grave registration teams. The belief, written into military policy, was that black soldiers were not suited for combat. It was prejudice wearing a uniform. But reality on the battlefield doesn't care about prejudice. Reality answers only to courage and competence. Units like the Tuskegee Airmen shattered expectations in the sky. The 761st Tank Battalion punched through Nazi armor on the ground. And in the heart of Europe, in the mud and snow, there was the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the men whose boots now walked toward Wereth. Life in a segregated military. Their service was a contradiction. They were fighting fascism abroad while facing discrimination at home. On American bases, they trained in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, took orders from white officers even if they outranked them in skill, received hand-me-down uniforms and equipment. They heard slurs from men they were risking their lives to protect. They watched German POWs sometimes treated better than they were. They were soldiers in uniform, yet to many still not equals. And still they served, not out of blind loyalty but belief. Belief that service could build a better America. Belief that courage could prove value where words were ignored. The 333rd, a quiet force with heavy guns. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was not glamorous. No fighter planes, no tanks, no headlines. They operated M1 105mm long Tom howitzers, massive guns capable of throwing a 95-pound shell across 9 miles. Artillery doesn't wear fame, it wears discipline, mathematics, cold calculation, steel nerves. The 333rd arrived in Normandy after D-Day. They fought through hedgerows, villages, forests. They supported infantry divisions as they pushed toward Germany. Their accuracy earned respect. Their reliability earned trust. Their calm under fire earned reputation. By winter 1944, they were veterans. The war seemed to be winding down. Snow fell across Europe. Christmas decorations appeared in liberated towns. American troops rotated off the front line to rest. And then the ground shook. December 1944. The Ardennes erupts. The German counter-offensive struck like a hammer. 250,000 German soldiers, tanks, artillery, smashing into thin American lines. Many US units panicked. Radios screamed. Command posts fell. Entire battalions shattered in hours. In that chaos, orders went out. Hold as long as you can. The 333rd understood. They stayed. Their guns roared in freezing air, firing shell after shell. They heard infantry retreat past them. They saw tanks burning in the forest. Still, they fired. Artillery crews are easy targets once the line breaks. They cannot run quickly. Guns are heavy, positions fixed. Keeping firing positions as the enemy approaches is one of the most dangerous missions in war. They did it anyway. Shell casings piled in the snow, barrels steamed, officers shouted coordinates, and when German armor emerged through trees, they lowered barrels and fired point blank. Artillery used as defense cannons. They knew the risk. They stood anyway. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud heroism. It was duty, discipline, courage without applause. When the order finally came to withdraw, it was too late for many. Some surrendered and were taken to POW camps. Some died at their guns. And some, 11 of them, moved silently through the forest, away from the smoke and toward Wereth. They didn't run because they were afraid. They ran because they had done their job, and now survival was the mission. The harsh irony. They had proven themselves on the battlefield, not in speeches, not in policy debates, but in the absolute truth of combat. And yet they knew. Capture meant torture, not imprisonment. Skin color was as dangerous as enemy bullets. Survival meant moving silently through snow, deeper into unknown country. They were not only fighting the German army, they were walking into a confrontation with ideology. An ideology that had been preparing itself for them since the posters on the Rhineland in 1919, since the lies printed in Munich, since Mein Kampf put hatred into pages. They walked through the Ardennes like shadows, not ghosts but men whose story history almost erased. Their steps were slow, their breath heavy, their hope fragile. America would later call them heroes. Europe would build a memorial. But on that night they had none of that, only each other, only the cold, only the knowledge that duty had brought them here, and prejudice might not let them leave alive. And yet they kept walking. Because courage is not always charging forward. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to give up when the world gives you every reason to. If you're here because untold stories deserve light, like and subscribe to support the mission, not for hype, but for truth. What kind of courage does it take to defend a nation that has not yet fully defended you? December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes forest, a maze of trees, snow and silence. The 11 men from the 333rd had escaped the artillery line, but escape is not freedom. It is just another battlefield with no maps, no orders, and no guarantees. They moved through deep snow, numb feet dragging, rifles held low, breath sharp in frozen air. Every sound mattered, every snap of a branch, every rustle in the dark. A single mistake could mean discovery. And discovery here meant something different for them than for other American soldiers. They were not just escaping Germans. They were escaping ideology. An enemy with no mercy for men who looked like them. Hours passed. Snow thickened. Darkness fell. They had no food, almost no water, no shelter. But they did not stop. Soldiers don't march forever on muscle. They march on will. And theirs was iron. Still, even iron bends under winter. PFC James Leatherwood stumbled first, slipping on ice. Corporal Robert Green caught him, steadying him, whispering, "Stay up, man, just a little more." The group said almost nothing. Words froze in the air. Sound traveled too far in silence. They followed roads only when they had to, then cut back into woods, avoiding tracks, avoiding villages. But survival sometimes demands trust and risk. As night approached, they saw a flicker of light through trees. A farmhouse, smoke, warmth, civilization, or danger. They hesitated. Approaching a home meant exposure. Approaching a human meant trust. In war, trust is a rare resource, sometimes rarer than ammunition. But frostbite and hunger don't negotiate. They approached slowly, weapons lowered, hands ready to raise and surrender if civilians appeared. They knocked. The door opened to Matthias Langer, a Belgian farmer. Behind him stood his wife Maria, and somewhere in the house were their children. The couple didn't speak English, but some things don't need translation. Exhaustion, cold, desperation. Those are universal languages. The Langers understood instantly. They stepped aside, no hesitation, no fear in their eyes, or rather, fear overcome by humanity. Inside, the men sat by the stove. Maria placed cups of hot coffee in their shaking hands. Bread was passed. Frostbitten fingers thawed. Wet gloves steamed. Boots softened. Hope, a small, fragile flame, flickered. For a moment, the war was outside. Only dignity lived inside that kitchen. One soldier whispered, "Feels like home again." But war always hears footsteps. And sometimes danger doesn't come from the battlefield. It comes from your neighbor. A villager, a known Nazi sympathizer, had seen them enter. He did what fear and ideology often combine to do: betray. He informed a nearby German patrol, not just any patrol, but men from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Fanatical, ideologically indoctrinated, the kind who knew exactly what black soldiers represented to their worldview. Night fell. The stove crackled. The soldiers warmed their hands and talked quietly among themselves, planning their next move. Then headlights, engines, voices, boots on snow. The SS arrived. The decision. The Americans could have fought. They were armed. They had combat experience. They knew fear, and they knew how to overcome it. But they also knew something higher: the cost to others. If they fought here, if a bullet flew inside this house, the Langer family would die. Not might die, would die. The SS did not forgive mercy. So the 11 stood up. They did something that looked like surrender, but was actually sacrifice. They walked outside, hands raised, to protect the family who had protected them. No dramatic music, no speeches, just dignity. Outside, the SS demanded their weapons. The men complied. They were not captured, they were claimed by ideology, by hatred, by a system that never recognized their humanity. The SS did not march them toward town. They marched them into a field. Even without orders, soldiers sometimes know exactly what comes next. The Americans did not beg. They did not break. Soldiers rarely do when death looks them in the eyes, especially soldiers who have already spent a lifetime surviving things others never faced. The snow kept falling, covering footprints as fast as they formed. In the farmhouse, Maria Lange cried quietly. Matthias held his children close. There was nothing more they could do, except pray. The quiet horror begins. The SS lined the men up in the cold, but bullets did not come first. Orders in German, boots in snow. The slow beginning of brutality. Torture before execution, not for information, not for strategy, but for ideology. Because in that moment these men were not killed for being soldiers. They were killed for being black. And then the field went silent again. War has a way of covering cruelty quickly, like snow over blood. But before we go to that frozen ditch, before the autopsy reports, before the forgotten files and silent headlines, we must understand one more thing. They knew this could happen, and they still served. They still fought. They still stood. Heroes are not only those who die in glory. Sometimes heroes are those who die unseen, but whose dignity refuses to die with them. If you believe bravery is not measured by recognition, but by sacrifice, stay with us. Stories erased are stories we are obligated to restore. Where does courage come from when the world offers you no promise of honor, only the danger of silence?